In this video, we're going to go deep into the art of drawing heads and faces. I'm going to show you how to design and draw and create a unique character. And then I'm going to show you how to extract the unique features and forms from that character's face so that we can then draw the same character from different angles and make them feel and look the same. We're going to go over concepts such as the Loomis method. We're going to talk about the history of constructive anatomy, and I'm going to show you how to extract interesting features and forms from real people's faces so that we can actually create truly unique, interesting characters. Because over 25 years as a professional artist and 15 years as a teacher, I can tell you that anatomy is important, but it really only matters when you can apply it to your style and then actually apply it in real illustrations. So we're going to talk about all of that. Now, as usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. This is a real-time, fully narrated masterclass workshop. I'm going to show you exactly how to do this in real time from start to finish. If you want a quick version of the Loomis method, go watch TikTok or something, because in this one, I'm going to show you exactly how it works so that you can figure out how to create your own unique characters and draw them again and again from different angles. All right, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I have been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. So in this video, I'm going to be using a framework for understanding how to actually apply anatomical knowledge to drawings in your style so we can exaggerate them. And also, more importantly, how we can apply this knowledge to actual illustrations, because these things are a little bit different. So we're going to start by actually creating an interesting character in an applied way. And then after that, what I'll do is break down how I'm using standard anatomical atelier methods that have been passed down to us over hundreds and in many cases thousands of years. And then I'll look at how I'm exaggerating those, adding character to those, and how this is going to allow us to then draw that same character from different angles. Because ultimately, often what we're about is trying to create or design either our characters or someone else's interesting character and be able to recreate that, draw it from different angles, and kind of emote through it and make it recognizable no matter how we draw it. Now, where do we start with this? We have a blank page, and in many cases, overcoming the blank page is half of the challenge. I've been doing this for over 25 years as a professional artist, and I've designed hundreds, thousands of characters, so I just kind of normally sketch around. But I know a lot of you, and you maybe like this, want more of a framework, so I thought we'd do something fun here. I'm actually going to pick an existing character that was a real person who is related to our story here in terms of constructive anatomy, and that is the famous Jean-Leon Gerome, who taught in the academies in France and was an amazing artist and quite a character. Look at this dude. He also has really interesting, distinct bone structure and features, and I thought it would just be a fun thing to do. Yeah, what a character. Screw having this guy as your anatomy teacher. So Gerome actually was responsible for a lot of the constructive anatomy that we know in the kind of American studio systems. George Bridgman, known for constructive anatomy, studied under Gerome in the academies in France, and then brought a lot of that knowledge back, as other people did, and was probably directly responsible for the stuff you would see in the Andrew Loomis books, which I'm often sort of talking about because Andrew Loomis taught under Bridgman. So you can trace back a lot of the lineage of constructive anatomy back to Gerome, although he certainly did not invent much of it at all, but he was really good at teaching it. And yeah, what a character. So I'm going to create a space pirate based off Jean-Leon Gerome, the famous artist and teacher. Because, yeah, interesting guy. Now, if we try and break down his features initially, because I'm really just doing this so you can see where I'm going with it, he has quite strong bone structure. He's got a really strong sort of pointy nose. He has an iconic mustache. He's got really sort of strong, interesting cheekbones. And you can see he's got a couple of really good iconic features that are worth paying attention to, right? He's got very strong brow, and his it would be his right eye, our left eye that we're looking at is slightly more lidded than the other. And yeah, just interesting structure. Seems like a person of interesting character. Again, who knows what he was actually like. But let's have a go at this. So what we're going to do, I'm just in Photoshop and we're just going to be sketching around. And I'm going to walk you through how I would start one of these and how we would sort of go about thinking about constructing it. And I'm going to use the constructive anatomy that someone like Gerome would have taught. A little bit different though, because we're using a modified Loomis method. So if we start with our sphere and actually divide that sphere into two in the horizontal and the vertical, we get our classic midpoint. Now, a big part of constructive anatomy is understanding a lot of these basic proportions, which were defined very, very long ago. A lot of these go back to ancient Rome and beyond, where we really kind of saw people try and divide the face into idyllic proportions. And this is where we get, through the Loomis method, the division of our first proportion, our second proportion that's equal, and our third proportion. And this really is just the head, forehead, the top of the brow to the hairline, although with Gerome, his hairline was back, but, you know, as a rough idea. This is not about internal constructive anatomy. This is just about proportions of features. Important distinction. But as part of Loomis, again, we're going to chop off the side, draw a line down there, and this is what we're working with. Now, critical to understand is that the eyes are actually placed according to typical anatomical proportional markers, which again are based on an idealized Western anatomical model, about halfway up the face. So what you should see is that the eyes, like the actual middle of the eye, is about halfway up the face. Again, this will vary a little bit, but that's also a really good marker. So make sure we're dividing all of that properly. And then obviously what we do roughly is break it down like this. Now, important to what I was saying is that we have these idealized proportions that are very much part of how we learn anatomy. And these are not necessarily the most interesting proportions. These are just proportions that we kind of know. And so we often start with these, but we need to modify them in order for this to be interesting. So I'm going to indicate a little bit the mound of the mouth. And if you're using the Loomis method, the mouth, or the rough sort of line of the mouth, is going to line up somewhat with the bottom of the initial sphere we construct. And what I've done here is, again, just rough in a very basic standard proportional set. This character has no character yet. It is just me roughing in the primary forms of a head. And this is a really good place to start. Gerome was not a burly individual, and neither is this space pirate going to be. And this is exactly the kind of exercise you would use if you are doing character design. So let's see if we can add some features that would maybe give us a little bit more of this character and see what we can do. So this is the structure, but what I need to do is exaggerate the structure, which again, I'll do periodically. I'm going to put in roughly where this mustache would go. So I find the center line, and we're going to have something like that. Right, we're going to have the lips going there. We've got the chin going here. Boom. And this is just the underdrawing. We will work this up. We'll add a lot more. This is just the first structural pass. And he did have quite a strong cranium. We're also going to put in some indications that would be underneath the form that are going to help us to understand some of these extra features, because you can really see his cheekbones here. So if we understand where a lot of those skull eye sockets are going to be, and where the skull is going to be. It's going to help us to understand what is fixed. Boom. All right. So again, we're just roughing it in and moving through and just getting the basics down. One of the biggest challenges you have if you're learning constructive anatomy or anatomy at all is you can see now, I still have this weird thing. It doesn't look like anything. It looks silly. It looks ridiculous. That's normal. That's fine. And also, one of the things you'll kind of notice is when you do it like this, we have this massive cranial mass. And yeah, this kind of looks sort of weird. So again, let's see if we can put this hairline back quite a bit. And here, let's put in the ear. And the ear is going to be between the eye line and the nose, roughly. Again, everyone's ear is different, but that's a good place to put it as a rough guide. So if we look at these really interesting features he's got, I'm going to put these in a bit of a comic booky style, but this, right, this eye is really lidded. This one is slightly less lidded. And he has what looks like quite expressive eyebrows, but a bit of a deadpan look, right? So we'll work out some of this anatomy, but for now, what I'm doing is just trying to get a rough indication of proportion, and then we'll sort of sketch things in. Now, often what you need to do in order to make this work is exaggerate. So we can try and constrain ourselves to accuracy, and this will get us pretty far, right? Like this gets us to a nice indication of who the character might be. But I think what I probably need to do is, right, push this nose a little bit. Make it really clear. And again, think about, depending on your style, you're going to represent these things differently. And we're doing this in a comic booky way, so yeah, I'm going to push it even more. Boom. So what we do, once you have a solid understanding of the anatomical structure, what's going on, right? Important to show the upper lid with the lidded look, so it's very clear kind of what's going on. I'm kind of combining structure, exaggeration, style, all these things at once, right? And we'll break it down in a minute. And still, we've still got our weird anatomical look. Let's see if we can make this a bit more space pirate. Because here's the biggest challenge to all of this anatomical stuff is I can get this drawing exactly right, and it's still going to look boring as anything because there's no character. Something that's I often mention is if you took this character or any great character from film, any of the great character actors, if you took them and shaved all their hair off and gave them a real sort of deadpan look, they're all going to look boring. And often what happens is as we try and get more accurate, things just end up looking really dead. So let's see if we can, let's remove some of these indications. I've still got the hair here. All right, now I've got this ear. So I've put in this structure, and as I go, I basically slowly kind of removing it. So instead of giving him the 1800s hair look, right, let's think a little bit more about, right, can we give him like faux retro 80s mullet style or something similar? And I'm going to give him a few hyper stylized technical body mod elements. And again, we still need to push the character because this guy is still looking pretty dull at this point. So let's think about some type of prosthetic here. Let's maybe turn this one down. All right, let's maybe tuck this back. And yeah, let's see if we can make him look a little bit more discerning. I think we should open this eye up a little bit. So again, still kind of rough, but we're getting there. We could probably get rid of that, and we could probably make his chin a tiny bit pointier. All right, getting there. So that's probably enough of a little sketch to kind of start with. And you can see, look, we're probably not 100% getting there. It's not a likeness, but that gives us somewhere to start and begin. Now, we can keep working with some of those right, sci-fi style, right, modifications, right, maybe look as if something weird is going on there. All right, it's got this jaw plate. And we could probably make that a little bit more feel as if it is actually replacing the jaw or some aspect of it. All right, so that's fun. Anyway, how long have we spent? About 15 minutes. So just sketching around, doing this tiny little thing. And yeah, I have to zoom out to, really kind of see what's going on. Let's zoom back up and see what we can do. So now that I've got this, typically the clavicle, right, is kind of one proportion below. So a good rule of thumb to use is that the kind of chest and the neck is sort of going to end up about one of these proportional markers, right? Sort of 1, 2, 3, right? One of those below. Okay, so I'm going to give him right, let's see if I can add some extra techie stuff. Again, this is super comic booky, right? This is kind of what I would do if I was trying to design something like this for a comic book style, right? Less so video games, right? You'd probably want to do more if this was a video game. Boom. All right, starting to get there. And then let's make this hair actually sit where we kind of want. Again, I'm going somewhere with this. Hopefully it's going to look cool. All right, now, yeah, let's think about maybe some body armor. Boom. All right, let's think about some of the anatomy we got here that we want to exemplify and push. All right, and again, maybe some kind of body armor shoulder pad kind of thing. Again, probably won't end up drawing all of this, but that's the rough idea. Okay, so we got a rough sketch, right? Let's look at how we would build this up and understand more of the anatomical form. Because again, this is a rough little sketch, right? This is it's not bad, but in order to understand what we're drawing, I think it's good to apply more actual rendering and a little bit of drama to this. Okay, so I'm going to put it in a frame because this allows us to apply and think about some illustration principles here. So we're going to think of this as if it is a portrait of this character, and this allows me to think about focus, background, and how we actually apply things. And we'll be discussing here in this part of the demo how to contemplate constructive anatomy and form and look at how it actually applies to illustration. Because one of the problems that a lot of people have when it comes to really understanding how illustration and anatomy connect is that often we don't want to show things. So this is still going to be sketchy. This is a concept art style that I'm going to be using. So if I was to really do a proper detailed rendering of this, it would take a lot longer, right? This is just going to be a bit sketchy. So otherwise this would be a 5-hour video and it'll probably be still a pretty long video. But stick with me, because if you really want to understand how this stuff functions, we have to go here, right? We have to do this. So I'm going to fade this down. And what I've got here, and this is another important thing to understand, is that like what I've done here by constructing the character is I've gotten a certain amount of detail there. But I probably have to redraw a whole bunch of it if I actually want it to feel right. And often that means kind of redoing some of the anatomy. So I'm going to look for this line here. And yeah, he's got that really sort of gaunt face, right? Where we can see this kind of line goes there, but it really sort of tucks in. So I want to sort of express that because I feel like that's really critical to this style of character. Now, again, I do feel like his nose is sort of very distinctive. And I think that's worth sort of referencing. Right, so let's, again, if I was to find, I'm still doing structure though. I'm still thinking about, and I'm still probably going to put in some of these elements of where the actual center lines are, because we can always erase those at any point. Right, we could maybe put in the far nostril on the other side. Right, and again, here, I normally don't, when I'm drawing comics, I normally don't create this much detail for characters because I'm normally drawing things a little bit further out. When I'm concepting for video games, yeah, I often do go to this level. But normally when I'm working on video games, because I have more of a stylized comic booky vibe to my art, people are looking at me for advice on how to simplify. So that's often what I get kind of paid to do when I'm working as a concept artist, is not add tons and tons of detail. But this is where it's super important to understand that the anatomical skills that you build need to be applied. So I'm going to learn the same way that someone like Gerome would teach, maybe a little bit less technically, because I'm not as interested in the realism aspect of it. Because back in the day, people were really trying to represent the reality and create these fantastical scenarios. Like the scenes that Gerome was creating were like no one could imagine this, right? Like no one would ever be able to think of this in their mind. And this would be like the first and only way that you'd ever be able to get this type of imagery, because it just couldn't exist before that. There's just no physical way. So they were very interested in representation. But what I'm thinking about here and what I'm visualizing is the different elements of the skull. So we've got our eyes here, and I'm representing the lid of the eye, right? Often also the hood of the eye, which again, depending on kind of where you come from, is going to be slightly differently represented. But fundamentally, oh, where's my eraser? It is huge. But fundamentally, even if I'm just drawing in a very stylistic way, I'm still thinking about where all that structure is. So we're thinking about those marks that I put in earlier that now aren't there for the skull. Right, if we think about where the skull would be, underneath here, right? We're still kind of thinking about a lot of those primary kind of markers and where they would go, etc. And those could also be really good if you do want to create prosthetics, right? Like that might actually be a really good line to use when I'm trying to think about like how to create mechanical bits and pieces for the character or what have you. All right. So anyway, I'm going to try and do this relatively quickly. Boom. Boom. Right. And a big part of this is to illustrate how when you just have boring anatomy characters, boring anatomy man, boring anatomy girl, it's really challenging to get them to look right. And I think one of the biggest problems that a lot of people have is simply that they're trying to draw really boring things and then they're going, why is this boring? And the reality is, well, you're drawing something boring. Like it's an individual with no character, no personality, no life to them. And it's going to have no personality and no life. And then often we've got all these construction marks everywhere, which, you know, aren't really helping us. And everything is about application. So we only need to learn this anatomy stuff insofar as it helps us to create and execute the drawings that we want. And that's very much, you know, how I like to teach anatomy and what I think is really important to understand about it. And that's why I'm starting this with not a whole bunch of information on how you would take this character and draw them from different directions, because that just shows us the underlying structure. And what we want to understand first is how that underlying structure is going to actually be used in the end. Right. So here, I'm thinking about the mound of the mouth as I draw the mustache, right? We're trying to make it fit underneath, and to a certain degree, right? We probably aren't going to see the mouth there. Boom. Right, like it's a lot easier to just hide it. And again, the way you would render this be completely different based on your style, but we would still be using exactly the same concepts, right? It doesn't matter whether you have a really simple style, a really detailed style, you're still going to be utilizing the same simple concepts that we all use. And that is really the important thing to understand about like anatomy is this is what connects us. it doesn't matter what style you have, right? We're all going to learn the fundamentals. We're all going to learn the things that have been handed down to us by people like Gerome and Bridgman and Loomis and all the other people who developed that stuff in the atelier systems of Europe, the oral traditions, people who put it into plates, were utilizing the same concept. But what you're looking at here is application. So if we go back to that concept that I was discussing, often when we're learning anatomy, all that we focus on is boring, static Loomis heads, construction, and this is important, but we're never going to be able to emotionally connect to it until we actually create something from it. You can do all the écorché studies, you can do all the primary form studies, you can do all that stuff, but probably it's going to look a little bit lifeless. And these days, often what we're after is actually style, exaggeration, because creating stuff that looks three-dimensional and rendered and real has kind of been solved in many ways by photography, by 3D, and certainly there are a lot of people who do that and add to it, but probably if you're listening to this channel, you're more interested in style. And this is where the connection is less clear. Like, how do we use that constructive anatomy that you would have learned in an academy 100 years ago or 200 years ago and actually apply it to something interesting? And what you find when it comes to application is that we're often not drawing in all those marks. We're often drawing those things in our style. I'm often exaggerating, right? So if we look at my little barbarian character here, he is not following the 3 division rule, right? Like the bottom proportion of his head is almost as big as his whole head, right? Because I'm playing with it, because I'm exaggerating it. And that's where we apply anatomy. So what I'm demonstrating here is applying anatomy to something that is actually interesting, which is, to me, the whole point of it. But yeah, soon we'll move on to actually kind of rendering this. But as I said, what we'll do after that is look at how we would draw the same character now that we understand them from different angles. Now, the reason that we don't start with that is because we just kind of end up with a whole bunch of messy sketches. And I think it's much better to understand here how those things actually apply. So let me know if this kind of helps. Boom. All right. Again, I'm going to start to speed up a little bit just to knock this out, because often, how long have we been going here? 12 minutes. Not bad, but we need this to be a concept style piece. Boom. So again, probably I could and I should slow down a bit and make this a little bit more detailed and kind of figure it out. I might do a little bit more drawing here and there, and we'll sort of add a little bit of drama to it, right? I could probably put a little bit of shadow under his nose to really kind of push that, right? I could make the right under the chin here a little bit more extreme, right? Push some of that, get a bit more drawing into it. Boom. And because I have the other thing is, like when you're trying to solve a drawing, right? If you just have anatomy to work with and you don't have a goal, it's very hard to know like what to optimize for, what to focus on, like what the whole point of this whole thing is. Whereas I think when you sort of know where the illustration ends, right, like what the point of it is, then it's a lot easier to understand how to prioritize the information you're learning. Right. And yeah, I think here as well, we should kind of have some sense of, It being a suit that he's kind of wearing or something. All right, so here I'm going to move back to sketchy mode. All right, thinking about maybe he's got some kind of armor or something like that on. This is going to get pretty rough. Tropes that I've kind of used before. Boom. But we'll see that I can probably, again, rush through this. Again, let's think about, here's our kind of clavicle, right? That's going to run across here. That's where that actual shoulder is going to be. He's looking a bit chunky here versus maybe what he would actually be, but it's all right. So again, we could probably spend a little bit more time on the actual design of this. Make it look a little bit cooler. Let's let's leave it there, and we'll see if we can come back and add some rendering so we can understand how all these things we've just done actually relate to creating finished illustrations. One of the other challenges you have when you're sort of learning anatomy is often when we're dealing with Loomis, we're dealing with these linear constructions. So it's a matter of lining things up, finding proportion. But drawing is very much about form, even when you're just creating something like this, which is a like little funny, cartoony image. But understanding what's happening with a lot of the actual anatomy is what will let you add the form, add the shadows, and figure out where everything goes. So that's what we'll look at next. And that's also critical if you want to rotate the head and understand how to draw it from different directions. Okay, so I'm going to change the lines a little bit here, and let's get started. So this is where we were. I did a little sketch, created some finished lines, and hopefully you've seen through creating those finished lines how I'm sort of applying some of these concepts, and we'll take it one step further. I'm going to see if I can decrease the contrast of this, right? And probably, let's see if we can, make it a little bit cooler. Cool. All right. Now, all I'm going to do now is just add some really simple flat colors. Now, depending on the process that you want to use, you could do this any way you want. This is a really simple way to just block things in. But if you're not actually applying the things that you learn with your anatomy, like if you're not actually constructing heads that are fun for you, then it's really hard to understand how to succeed with this, because often what happens is you can just cycle endlessly when it comes to anatomy. It's so easy to just infinitely get better and better and better at something like, something we're not quite sure of. All right, got brush pencil. But like if you're drawing a non-specific character, it's very hard. It's like, is this nose right? Is this eye right? Like, oh, eyes aren't like that. Eyes are like this. It's like eyes are different depending on what character you're drawing and what expression they have and what the point of it is, right? That's like so important to understand. Like the emotional content of what you're doing is critical. So I'm going to use a really simple block-in technique here. let's see if we can find a slightly rougher, more graphic version of this hair. And I feel like maybe having this hair like wider might be good, right? Let's play around with that. So I'm literally just painting this stuff in. And this is pretty similar to how I would do concept art with line work. This looks really rough, but I think we'll kind of get somewhere in a sec with it. All right, now let's block in the rest of this. So a little bit of messiness will probably help us here. Boom. And I'm just going to put in some simple flat local colors, as this is a great way to understand. Let's make that a little bit more metallic. It's a great way to, just kind of not worry so much about the detail. And if you're loose in the right ways, it'll actually enhance what's going on. Okay. So let's see if we can make this a little bit more colored. All right, let's see if we can increase the darkness of this. And like maybe, all right, like this could be a bit lighter, we'll see, or maybe I should sort of leave it dark, I don't know. Maybe something like that will be enough, we'll see. So again, just blocking in some rough stuff. I'm going to take the eye color, make it larger, wider. All right, I'll get this. It just means it won't feel like boom, like solid white. And we'll add a bit of, color variation to our local color. All right, got my red here. So this is mostly about anatomy and structure. Obviously, there are things you would kind of do to enhance the, sort of rendering of this, like make it feel a little bit more realistic, right? You do your standard stuff like increasing the, or decreasing the saturation of the skin around the male sort of facial hair. But I think this will be enough. Cool. And here again, like maybe we could make one of these, I don't know, like slightly different. Who knows? All right, let's make this. So this looks rough, and it is, but I think we'll be okay. All right. Let's add in some shadows. So this is where a lot of that anatomy stuff that we've done, pick a slightly different brush here. Right, a lot of that anatomy stuff that we've done is going to help us. So I'm going to pick a really simple shadow style, something that I've made a video on recently. 50% black layer. I'm just going to add some shadows. So we're going to have light coming from above, and we're going to look at how this form changes everything. It's only when you start to add this stuff that your kind of drawings are really going to feel dimensional. So you can either study with charcoal or study with grayscale, in which case, like, you'll figure out how to add form to your kind of studies. But the problem then is you're actually using a different technique and a different mode of drawing and a different set of tools than what you normally use. So if your goal is to start with a black and white tonal image and add rendering to that, then that's totally valid. But if your process is different, what you want to do is actually make sure that you are using the same sort of process to practice your anatomy as you would actually use to create illustrations. And often that means you kind of have to understand, how does the form that you're using actually apply? So again, if we go back to this concept, this is often what is missing, is we just get stuck in anatomy treadmill land, going again and again and again, doing more and more of these. And we're often studying with different tools, different techniques than what we actually would prefer to do, because it's very hard to study and do these sort of drawings and then actually apply form to them. But the whole point of figuring out where those planes of the faces is so you can apply the form, right? So you can apply the shadow, and so you know where the structure is. So when I'm sort of doing a simple kind of illustration like this, you can see I don't have any shading, right? It's abstract, it's iconic, a very different style. I'm still thinking of all the same things when I put these little weird derpy lines in there. When I'm creating this, which is like kind of weird characters that have a pretty distinct style, this doesn't fit the standard proportions, right? Like the forehead here is a lot smaller. This feels a lot more stylized, but I'm still thinking about those things. The trick that will make your stylized characters feel more dimensional, allow you to draw them from different dimensions and directions and angles, and also actually design characters that will work in 3 dimensions, is understanding the form. So that is a critical thing. It's not just a matter of drawing it. It's a matter of, as I draw it, I'm going to understand more of where the form is. So again, light's just coming from above, and that means here it's going to be shaded. Now I can cut into this, and I will in a bit. But firstly, what we're going to do is just block this in very roughly. And I'm still doing this pretty faintly, right? But underneath these cheekbones, we're going to have shadow, right? Underneath the nose, we're going to have shadow. On the planes of the face, right? We've got the side profile of your temple, right? We get a very different tonal arrangement. You can see here, again, on his face, right? We still see a bit of a shadow there. So these are the primary shadows. This is what we're adding first. And then we'll look at kind of making this more subtle. And this also is a really important thing, is you can't figure out what those details are and those secondary forms are until you block in your primary forms. And often all of this, before you even get out of the gate, all of this fails because we're trying to add detail and make the character feel real. And you're like, often what happens is, I'll be doing something like this, but I'm not quite sure of how exactly these forms are working, right? I'm not confident in my ability to render them. So I sort of go in there and try and be like, right, I'm going to start rendering the nose first off, right? I'm going to go in there and be like, let's render the nose. And I just end up with sort of something brushy, something messy, like, yes, it's adding more form. What we want to do is, and this is exactly the kind of technique you would get from a traditional sort of atelier or anything like that. Good sort of picture making and illustration theory is that what I want to do is make sure I block in all my shadows first and just understand roughly where is the light coming from, right? Like, where is that light coming from? And as I progress through that, I can push that up, I can pull that down, right? I can use my eraser to soften some of these, right? Because that was kind of like a little bit harsh. Like maybe I want to kind of soften that. But often what you'll find is that we actually want to maintain the feeling of this being quite solid and two-toned, right? Like if you add too much shading here, like, and you start to, get sort of fussy with it and add softness to it, we're sort of missing that initial block in that we often need, right? So again, it's really easy, as I'm doing here, to be like, oh, I want to go in here and carve out some of these little bits and pieces and refine this form. Yes, that may be good, but it's just going to confuse things. What we want to do initially, and I've got these lines that I put in. These lines are not necessarily reality, right? They're just an indication. But yeah, probably what I want to do is actually go through and just think about like, where are those primary forms of the face, right? Like how, right? Like how is one side of this form separate from another? As part of that, I do want to think about, right, the side of the nose though, because that is for sure something that has a lot of form. But yeah, just block it in. If you start messing around with detail, it all goes downhill. There's nothing to do with anatomy. This is just general drawing and illustration advice. So again, like that, we're starting to get there. I started to block it in, and this is going to give you a pretty good understanding of, what it might look like. Now, why are we doing this? Because if we want to draw a character from different dimensions, from different angles, you need to understand where the form is. This is the secret to everything. And this is why we look at, everything as sculpture, everything as form, everything as planes of the face, and we kind of avoid just drawing really simple character two-dimensional expressions and things. And we become, as artists, obsessed with form and dimensionality and structure. Like, that is the whole point of the Loomis method, of Bridgman's constructive anatomy. It's all about form, and that's what allows you to rotate the head. It's not just the Loomis method. The Loomis method is a great application and simplification and step-by-step guide, but what will actually allow you to do this is understanding these forms. So the more I understand those primary forms, right, now that I've kind of blocked them in, now I can go through and start to tweak, right? I can start to think about, like, oh, maybe it would be good if we kind of pushed a few of these or pulled this or whatever. All right, let's quickly add in some of this other stuff, right, under the pectoral, right? Show some dimensionality there. Again, this is brutally rough, but if we have a rough idea, even if it's brutally rough, of where all this stuff is, right, it's going to help us no end. Okay, so that is the initial block in, and at this point, you're pretty much home and hosed. The form is there, you can read the character, but still, it looks kind of static because we don't have a lot of illustration theory. We don't have a huge amount of application there. We still just have a technical rendering. So how long have we been going? Another 15 minutes on this. So let me add a little bit of detail to this to just look at how we can try and de-emphasize the anatomy and focus more on the character. And after that, we'll look at how we can break all this down and look at drawing this same character we've just created from different directions. Because part of this is, like, as I'm drawing this, I'm actually understanding much more about the form, how it relates to the skull, how the planes of this particular character's face work. And here's the secret. If you genuinely want to draw a character from different directions, don't do what I'm doing. Don't just design a character in a demo live and then try and figure out how to do it. It'll take you quite a while to really understand how to redraw that character from different angles. And if you want it to look interesting and not just like boring Loomis head, you're going to need to understand that character in detail and really get a feel for them. So we'll see how we go. But that is such an important thing to understand, is that, yeah, typically it's not just about rotating any head, right? Like any little kind of Loomis head or Sarah head or, like one of these little things, like, yeah, that's kind of cool. That's where we start. But if you're actually wanting to design your character, you need to learn how to draw them in more detail and really understand them at a deep level. Just a quick note before we move on. This year, I'm actually developing a new series of courses on constructive stylized anatomy with the goal to help you design and create your own characters and figure out how to pose them, breathe life into them, and draw them from all sorts of different angles. What I've been working on recently is the heads and faces one, which should be no surprise. I've been thinking about this for quite a while, and I got a bit of extra information about it down below. So check that out if you're interested in learning the proportions of the face, understanding how to draw your characters from different angles, and just keep things solid. I'm going to be running this intermittently as a live course with feedback and full live streams regularly each week, etc. But I'll also eventually have it available as a self-paced course you could get anytime you want to improve your anatomy. So check out that info down below. I should have a page you can go and look at it, and it'll tell you whether or not there's a live course coming up or whether you can just get the self-paced one. Anyway, let's get back to the demo and see whether we can draw some more characters. Now, to add those details, what we're going to do is create a new layer on top of our existing shadow layer. And I'm just going to pick to match the halfway to black that I had with the existing layer. I'm just going to pick something that's quite dark and not too saturated, but warm, because I think that'll give me sort of what I want. And now it's a matter of going through and just kind of tweaking, adding little bits and pieces. And often, for me, this is also a matter of maybe having to push and pull, right? Like move some of these things, put in a bit of detail, then maybe pull it out. We'll see. But I'm also going to flip this and we can paint with white. And I think we'll pick a kind of cooler color as a kind of cool highlight. The trick though is I'm just going to turn down the opacity on that brush so that I'm able to flow a little bit more. And this is where I'm going to try and push some of these secondary forms, some of these elements of the anatomy that are going to help to just create a bit more structure. And I'm going to do this initially with what I think of as a secondary pass on this form. And this means I'm not going to think too much about the details, but we're going to find where we need to add those sort of larger secondary details. And this is very much, if you're more of a drawer, this process is probably for you because it allows me to just go through, right, pick and pull little bits and pieces out. I'm not doing any real painting here. I'm really just drawing with some different tones. And like you would shade up and down the value scale, right? I'm like pushing and pulling. And we'll probably be able to do some rough rendering later with color to kind of change how some of these highlights appear, because these are going to be pretty kind of dull and waxy. But this will start to give us a bit of form to play with. And as I said, I'm going to put this in, and then often what I'll do is get the eraser, right, kind of pull it out, tweak things around. So this is not real kind of painting. I'm not really thinking about putting in particular colors. I'm mostly just considering, can we modify the form? Which is everything we need to do here. So we can think about adding a bit of tonality to these eyelids. Right, in these areas where there's like quite a lot of, there's not a lot of flesh, right? We typically get more reflectivity, right? On the bridge of the nose as well, we're going to get a little bit more reflectivity. You often may have a bit of a kind of highlight on the nose, which is not from there being a lot of bone there. It's often because there's just oil on the nose, and that gives you a little specular highlight. So often when I'm doing this, we can think of this as like concept art. And often with concept art, the goal is a little bit more about pushing the form and showing the form. So I'm going to bias towards that. But then we'll look at after how we can tweak this and, yeah, maybe add a bit more illustrative quality to things. And this is giving a pretty stylized look, right? It's sort of, I'm carving out the shapes. Yeah. Also, one of those things that's often talked about when it comes to how we would render things and good practices, general sort of art and illustration principles is, you're going to have a lot of success if you are a little bit more angular. Like if you're trying to show form, you can often really stylize things and push the angularity and the planes of the face a little bit more. That'll typically work. But yeah, you can see here how much we're going in 5 minutes. Yeah, like adding a little bit of stuff here. Again, I could push and pull some of the forms of the hair. This is a very, very common concept art technique, right? We create a line drawing, we add flat colors underneath, and then you kind of add highlights and shadows, right, in multiple passes. Super basic, super effective. It means we can kind of draw and design a little bit more. So everyone has their own process, but as a general rule, when we're trying to sort of define things, line work works really well, right? People will often paint things in the end. Obviously, everyone has, 3D base processes. So people might use all sorts of different ways of making art, especially concept art. But be surprised how many people still work professionally with just line and color and some kind of technique like this, right? It works. And if you get quick at it, you'd be surprised how fast it can be. Often in the beginning, a lot of people will worry about, but isn't it quicker to use a 3D base or whatever? Yeah, like once people have been using these techniques for, 5 years, 10 years, you can get really fast at creating cool stuff, So yeah, this is, like a pretty traditional concept for a technique, right? Putting in flat colors, then we're pushing and pulling. But yeah, the point is, that I'm making is this is production ready, still kind of works, and yeah, super basic. So anyway, I'm pushing this a little bit far, but we'll kind of see. I might pull some of it back. Working on separate layers like this, I think is a good sort of strategy. Now, there's a lot of concepts here that we need to sort of contemplate in terms of, creating form shadows versus cast shadows and that sort of thing. But here, the lighting's coming from above. So really, right, we're going to have some harder shadows around the bottom of the eyes. We're going to have some harder shadows where the nose is, right? This also is going to be a little bit of a harder shadow. And then like this sort of shadow here is going to push in, be a bit softer. And I'm just going to use some little sort of textural scumbling things to kind of imagine maybe we should beat this up a bit. Again, this would totally depend on what type of future you're kind of dealing with. All right, but yeah, now I'm going to pull a bit of highlight into the ear. All right, boom, boom. And yeah, we can also, add a bit of texture to this. All right, riff it up. So what you can see is, yeah, this will sort of very quickly come together. Right. And we can also start to think about, if you want, right, adding some extra rendering. Right, pick and pull some of these different shapes. We could maybe push the eyes at the end put a highlight on there or something. But anyway, you get the idea. So let's pull that off, put it on. Yeah, we're getting a little bit more rendering. I would say the rendering here is like not 100% sort of accurate. We could kind of work with it a little bit more, and I could smooth it out. So we'll look at kind of how to do that in a minute. This is just sort of an initial pass. And yeah, I'd probably go through and let's make the brush a little bit bigger. All right, look at how we could get a bit more of that happening here and there. Super rough. If you took a lot of this line work and shading off, right, this is just going to look like kind of squiggles. We're just pushing and pulling a little bit. And obviously, a lot of these details aren't really resolved, right? More rendering demo than a design demo. And an anatomy demo, obviously. All right. I think that's it. I think we're kind of out of time. Now, obviously, it doesn't make much sense that, this is getting a lot of light versus any other elements of the forehead. So I'm going to move that around, make it a little bit clearer, right? Add some shadows there. And yeah, you can keep pushing this up the value scale, right? All right. So next, what I'll do is see if we can blend this out a little bit. All right. Now that I've got my bases in there, probably what we could find is some of this is a little bit sort of harsh, or there's a little bit too much on it. Giving it a little bit too much gas, not enough brakes, too much sauce, whatever metaphor works for you. Again, this also is like pretty sort of fleshy, so let's get that, right? Let's see if we can lift the value, but yeah, not worry so much. Also, let's get rid of that line. I don't really think that's kind of helping us that much now. Right, it's a bit extreme. Boom. Cool. All right. So other things we can do, let's select this and see if we can add some overall global contrast, right? So we'll pick one of our sort of darkest values from here and just see if we can add some sort of general ambient light. It's probably a little bit much, but again, we can always sort of tweak it, push it and pull it. It's very much going to be biased by feeling like there's a lot of lightness around the frame, so it's going to make it feel a little bit darker. All right, I'm going to do this on a separate layer, but like maybe the other thing we could do is, right, like add a bit of light from the top, and you could either do it just like that as a flat, which may, right, this is going to take away some of my rendering. Actually, what I'll do, I think we still need to have this selected. Right, but yeah, we can sort of fade out some of that work we've done. Right, add a bit more sort of ambient light. And you could obviously also think about doing that as an overlay or something similar. Think about warming it up. Again, tweak things, whatever kind of works for you. And the last thing is, right, we can start to pull some of the darkness in here around the background, just to give things a little bit more atmosphere. Now, something else I'm going to do is, once I'm in here, right, just see if I can push, right, some of the darkness there. because you can play around with, and I'll just show you this as a technique, but we can certainly turn it on or turn it off. Right, we can think about adding some rim light, which will often, right, let's zoom up so you can see it as much as possible. All right, this can often make a big difference to being able to kind of pop out the form. Now, rim light as well is and part of the reason I'm doing this as a demonstration is that these are the kind of techniques that will, make things look more dynamic. But where you'll often find people fall down is trying to add rim light and not understanding that the rim light needs to follow the form. So if we just sort of put rim light in, but we don't really make sure that it actually follows the form, i.e. we don't understand where the form is in three-dimensional space, then it never works, right? You just sort of get that stencil look where it feels as if there's just a white outline. Right here, maybe we can think about, maybe does the back of this ear catch a little bit, maybe? Right, maybe that catches a little bit, I don't know. You could certainly also put, does this catch a little bit? Right, again, not 100% realistic there, I don't think, but yeah, kind of play around with it. Right, we can soften this a little bit. All right, let's soften this. Again, got the form going that way. And yeah, we could probably cut this in a little bit more, right? Like describe what's happening with this hair a little bit. So yeah, and we've got something that feels a little bit more dimensional. And lastly, what we can try is just kind of bring it out with good old Photoshop, some of the highlights. So maybe we could push some of these shadows down a little bit, make them a bit warmer. Well, actually, let's see if we can push them. Let's play around, right? All right, push some of this stuff down. Kind of inverting what I had. Now going to kind of warmer highlights for some of these. All right, bring this up. And we can also see if we can really modify the look of this. Hit the whites. This rim light. All right, let's. That's pretty subtle, but often if we did take this down, yeah, that would probably give us a slightly better look. So looking overall, not too bad, but a little bit lacking contrast. Let's see if we can pump up the contrast, right? And this will give us something that might feel a little bit better. Let's make sure that that only hits the luminosity. And yeah, there we go. And so from there, again, you can just play around with like where you want contrast or not contrast. But we got, yeah, something that works okay. And again, you could always play around with those color adjustments, right? Hard to say which one is going to be actually kind of worth it. That is the rough idea. So how long have we spent? Yeah, probably about too long, adding some little details, but yeah, you know what? Obviously, you could refine this, right? It's not meant to be super realistic. It's application, and that's the key to understand. Is that often, depending on the style you're going to use, how much realistic lighting you want to use, how important it is to actually sort of render the form, or show the form and have it be easily displayed, etc. Yeah, it's going to depend and change everything. So that's the first step, is design the character, understand the form. What we're going to look at next is how to actually take that and look at drawing this character from different angles. And when it comes to doing this, drawing it from different angles, this is where we do utilize the Loomis method as a way to block out our primary forms, but we quickly want to move to understand what those primary forms actually are and how to add our secondary forms. So let's add a couple of different options here. We've got our 3/4. What I'm going to add is our front view and our side view. And, we'll just keep this pretty simple. So if we look at the proportions there, I've got 1, 2, 3, and that's roughly what we're going to be dealing with. And we can always start somewhere by blocking in the basic anatomical markers that we know are going to be everywhere. So we know that if we kind of take this whole length, that the eyes are actually going to be halfway, or they're going to be like below this first marker, right? We know that the character has a relatively pointy chin, right? And we can always, we should make this probably lower down rather than higher up. But if we think about the primary forms here, this is very much about carving out all those primary elements. So let's look at what we're actually doing here. What we're trying to do with the initial Loomis construction is kind of approximate the skull a little bit. We're trying to get something close to this. And this really is a matter of this major kind of skull mass, like the cranium and the mouth. And what you'll see is the jaw is often actually moving in a little bit, right? The jaw, right, kind of comes in at a bit of an angle. And for Gerome, you can see it kind of comes down quite low. Right, it's quite low. It's sort of changing direction down quite low. So yeah, everyone's different here. This is the interesting thing. Like a lot of people, when it comes to their primary form and where those markers are, like there's some people where you can have 1, right, 2, 3, 4, but the jaw is going to change direction all the way up here. So if you think about, there's our ear. Yeah, some people's jaw is going to come down a lot lower, right? All of them are going to come in a little bit to a certain degree, but yeah, some people have a jaw that's much more like that. Some people are going to have a jaw that's a bit more like that. And these are the structural markers that we need to understand and exaggerate. So what we can tell is that, yeah, this jaw, I think is, even though it's kind of pointy, it comes down quite a bit. So if we think about the ears as being somewhat here. Again, let's make them slightly less prominent. And I'm just drawing a little jelly bean shape, but this will become the actual ear itself. His neck is not really much larger than his jawline. But this is the difference, is that often some people are going to look drastically different from front to back. Right? So here, right, he's got this nose. And if we look at how that nose is going to go here, let's block in some of these primary forms of the skull. He has quite a large cranium. Right? It seems like somewhat prominent up the, as it changes direction. So we need to, right, really represent that. Now the tear ducts, or the beginning of the eye in the middle, are going to line up roughly with the side of the nose. And we kind of typically have one eye width there, one eye width here, and then half an eye width to the edge of the face here. And that's typically where the face kind of ends, right? You still see the skull kind of behind, but often it's sort of covered by hair. His mouth is going to be somewhere in the middle. So again, we're blocking in a mix of standard proportions and then things that we can make into actually his proportions. As you will note, right now, it does not look like anyone or anything. And that's the fundamental lesson here, is that structural accuracy is pointless in terms of creating character, right? But if we look at what's happening with the skeleton and our Loomis construction, right, I'm going to tuck in, right? If you look at your kind of skeleton, that might be kind of small, but yeah, you're going to have that sort of brow ridge, right? If we were actually drawing the skeleton, right, we'd kind of have something like this, but we are not. We have a nose here. Now this is where we have to exaggerate a little bit, because this is what's going to make the character feel interesting. I think so, anyway. So if we were to draw him from the side, we're just going to extend that nose out. Right, and again, there's obviously a difference between how we would represent this depending on the style and how you kind of draw eyes. Right, he kind of has, again, there's these eyebrows that line up very much with everything else there. And this moustache really, right, where does it go to? Right, it's pretty straight, kind of goes out there. But you're going to have to design your own moustache. They're all going to be different. Right. So you can see we're beginning to find the character. Now, also, if you were to look at your skull from the side, you would see where, right, like where that eye socket goes. Right, so the eye socket is kind of there, and this bit is going to come up. Right, boom, and the ear is going to go in here. Right, and we're going to think about where is, well, we got this little guy here. So we're going to draw that. Right, then very high up, we got this hair. next to it, we've got this. He's got his weird jaw extension. Right, so again, the hair is going to be just a little bit above. It's going to go over the skull. Now, one of the things that we often sort of get wrong here in terms of understanding where the sort of skull ends and stuff is, yeah, if you do look at a skull, it actually is going to stop somewhere around the bottom of that third proportion, right? So the skull is actually stopping around here. Again, it's going to be a little bit lower, but then if you look at where the spine comes out, it's kind of right in the middle. So this is why the skeleton and understanding these proportions is so critical when you're trying to sort of break this down. Right? Is we're also going to have the neck kind of follow roughly that same line, right? Like the spine, right? So it comes up there, and the neck is probably, again, going to be, the spine is obviously, underneath the neck. If you kind of look at a lot of the sort of structure, we've often got like a lot of muscles kind of going there, but you can still feel your sort of vertebrae, right? Kind of here. It's more like the spine actually probably sort of goes like this. And again, I mostly do sort of comic booky anatomy, right? So we've got the kind of voice box. We have that little bone that sort of goes there. And obviously slouching forward a little bit here. And this is a really critical thing to understand when you're sort of trying to understand these proportions and how to draw this, is like, yeah, if you look at a skull, right, it obviously has the clean jawline, right? We've got that clean jawline. But when you look at a person, if you're looking at them in profile, often, right, again, depending on anatomy, but for a lot of people, that line is actually going to go straight back because there's a bit of flesh, right, kind of under here. Boom. Okay, and again, if we look at, okay, one proportion, and I've kind of ended up, right, this nose could probably be even, right, even more extreme, because I kind of got it coming out here. But yeah, if you sort of look at the proportions, right, sort of got like, here's where the hairline should be, right, 1, 2, 3, right, we're sort of roughly correct there. Yeah, boom. Here we're going to have the cheekbone. And probably for him, if you were looking at like which lines to draw, right, you'd be sort of trying to draw these ones. And obviously we'd erase all this and put this hair back. Boom, boom. And then it's a matter of putting in all these other little bits that we need to do. Right, boom. And then we have this other thing here. Right, that connects, goes to something over here. Boom. Not sure whether that's 100% accurate, but that'll kind of have to do for now. Might be more like, could probably put this thing, firstly, you could put this thing a bit further back. It feels like it's more like kind of here. Now, where does this thing go? Again, kind of there, boom. And yeah, this is how we think about drawing that same character from a different perspective. And all I'm doing is just observing those fundamental anatomical features, and I'm sort of exaggerating, right, where I think I need to be. And I think actually with him, I think this is going to be a bit more up. There we go. Let's put in our anatomical markers. Right. Nice. All right. And here, right, we've got one proportion, right, two. So we come down here. That's probably where the right cloud would be. That over here. Right, we're going to do the same thing. Right, put in our sort of voice box. And we've kind of done the front view, right? But again, the critical thing to understand is, I think this is where most people, and the reason I'm mentioning this like a million times is I feel like this is often where people stop and get frustrated. Is like when you're doing this, like I've actually done really good work here. I figured out the proportions. I've got it all right. But it still just looks like nothing, right? So I put in the primary forms, which is what the Loomis method is there to help us do. And it's still looking like nothing, right? And even this one, because it's very sort of structural, doesn't have any emotion, it still looks pretty static, right? I haven't really applied it. I haven't tried to think like, what is the character like? Where do all the lines go? I'm just kind of thinking about like, what's the structure of it, right? So again, his mouth is probably going to be around kind of here, but this mustache comes out here. Right. And again, if we think about where those bones of the skull are, right, and some of those sort of key markers that are going to be useful. Boom. All right, we got, right, if this was our kind of skull, and obviously, right, he kind of has this sort of structure there. All right, so we're starting to feel through doing this where some of these features might be. And as we add these secondary features and characteristics, this is where the character is really going to start to be seen. But still here, right, I'm wanting to kind of say, yeah, I got this. It's kind of wrapping around here. Again, I forgot to put this in. Something like that feels a bit more legit, right? Again, where are we? We're starting up here. And yeah, as you get better at, thinking about what goes where, you'll be able to sort of sketch this character out and, start to get a feel for them. All right, we got this. Boom. Etc. Etc. Right, shoulders are there. All right. So again, in order to understand that the features here, what we're going to deal with is, now I've got them placed. Everything else is just character. So again, this eye is a little bit less lidded. This one is much more, right, flat. Again, I'm representing that with my kind of style. This one is that's probably a little bit much. And so these are all messy little lines, but this is what builds the structure. Yeah, so as we start to add more of that character, right, we're going to start to feel the character. Still feel like we could probably make this chin a little bit longer. But yeah, that's how we do it. Right, and now we've got so this thing probably right from memory. This goes down here. Right, that comes there. This is more at an angle. Right, and then got something like that. Boom. So we still got a lot of, detritus everywhere in terms of the structure, but yeah, that's going to give us, a rough understanding of how we would get this character. And again, if we sort of move from anatomical markers to some markers that might help us more with form, right? Like think about actually rendering the flesh underneath there. We might get something a bit more like that. So again, that's a bit more of a turnaround, but it's just going through that process and breaking it down. That's how you will kind of do that. Now, if we look at how to maybe push things forward, this is where we can start to sketch around and maybe draw it from even more different, interesting angles. But hopefully through this, you can see that a couple of things are going to happen is that firstly, as you block in a character, until you put in their distinctive features, it's always going to look boring. It's always going to look bland. You're always going to have faces that look exactly the same. And until we kind of actually nail down some of those proportions, it's very hard to actually understand how to create different characters by modifying their features. So anyway, let's take a look at how we would create some more interesting angles for this character. As you get to know your character, it becomes a lot easier to play around with these things. So the first few times I draw it, I might run into trouble. And a lot of this is thinking about genuinely what kind of expression and what kind of angle do I actually want. And this is where the Loomis method comes in really handy, because it's going to allow me to have a system to systematize and create a sequence that will allow me to solve all these problems. So we did the same thing as we've done over here. I've created the sphere, but I've done what everyone wants you to do with those kind of Loomis method tutorials, which is we're actually drawing from a different angle. So it's important here to understand that we're still doing the same thing, right? We've still got 1 proportion, 2 proportion, 3 proportions, same sort of thing. We're just going to slightly, right? I got the side of the head. We're just going to maybe slightly make the top of that head disappear, right? Because we probably can't see it quite so much. Now, also understand this is blocking in. This is blocking in the primary forms. This is blocking in the primary forms of a standard head. So, if you're trying this, like this is where the eyes are actually going to go. If you're trying this, just understand that what we're trying to do is kind of approximate the skull, right? So you will see that, like, again, depending on what angle you've got the skull at, you're going to get a different kind of line. So you got to be really careful about where you actually start your center line, where it actually goes. I think it's really good to, in this case, kind of visualize that skeleton a little bit. Draw that mound of the mouth. But just through doing this, I'm really easily, let's make it a bit bigger so we can kind of see it relative to the others. Yeah, just a tiny bit. But yeah, I've got exactly the same structure. I'm trying to find the different anatomical features, right? Like here's going to be my eye socket. Here's my other eye socket, right? If I think about the brow ridge here, right? And where the sort of skull nasal cavity would be, I'm going to be looking at something like this. Right, boom. Got the mound of the mouth, or where the teeth would be. And again, as we said, if we were to kind of move these lines around, his jaw, or the place it changes direction, is quite low. And all we're going to do is just join this stuff up. And again, we are going to have a really boring kind of nothing, right? It doesn't look like anything, which is totally fine. Now remember that, again, this skull, right, if we sort of think about drawing through, right, the place that the spine connects, like sort of underneath, is about there. And here, when you think about like where is that in relation to everything else? Because if you actually tilt your head back, what you notice is like the back of your skull gets quite close to, the back of your sort of rib cage, right? So we sort of imagine that the neck is quite long, but it's actually, right, just kind of like, it's like tilt. It's really, see what I've got I have my skeleton model here, but no way to really kind of show it. So yeah, now where maybe the chin would be down here, right? And we might have the clavicle kind of here. And now we got that over there. So we think about this as the rib cage, right? Clavicle maybe is somewhere down there, right? What we're going to have is the neck, right, compressing over there. And again, let's see if we can find somewhere, like if we sort of imagine how far back this goes. I'm just guesstimating this, but if we think about the center line of the neck, right, it's going to be somewhere here. Boom. All right, boom. All right, there we go. Something like that. Again, super rough. Right, traps, deltoid. Probably this whole thing is going to be sort of pushed up, right, a little bit. But yeah, this gives us that ability to see, the head sort of tilted up. It's still not that full, we're looking up at someone, right? But the goal here is just to look at how do we continue to do that thing that we did, which is find our character's proportion in this system. So as normal, like the primary forms might actually be pretty close to the character, right? If we were to think about there being a skeleton, right? Right, the primary forms are there. It still looks nothing like the character, right? It's still completely nothing. So let's, maybe let's copy that one so we can have reference to it, because I think it'll be important to see the difference. And here, what we'll do is we'll get rid of some of this fluff, because one of the other challenges that people have with constructive anatomy is not understanding that, yeah, you kind of got to see the fog of war, right? These kind of crazy, weird construction lines that go everywhere. It is hard to see stuff through that. So often we do what I just did, which is just erase it back. It's a primary thing, or you put a bit of tracing paper over. So what I'm after here are, again, these primary elements, these primary forms. I've got my center line, right? So this is where we sort of decided this is probably, or maybe a little bit up, and that's where the bottom of the nose is going to be. Right, if I think about that, that's where, if I had a pencil stuck to my nose, right, and it's coming out, like if you kind of stuck a pencil to the top of your nose, like where is it, right? That's kind of what I'm thinking of, right? That's going to sort of come out there. And this is where we would construct, right, the underside of the nose, and then I'm just going to join it up, right? This is my primary form of the nose. Easy peasy. Now, this is where we need to exaggerate, and we need to understand what our job is here is to create character. So what I might have to do is, just push that a little bit further. Right, again, I'm sort of running out of detail to kind of really nail that, but let's see if we can put in some of those secondary forms of the nose. Again, that's getting pretty big. All right. But, I'm not measuring the length of the nose, but he has a pretty serious nose. All right, let's draw up, right? And do that either side, and we're going to find the tear ducts of the nose, right? Then I'm kind of going to guesstimate. There's a lot of different systems you can use to kind of find the width of things. And what you will kind of notice if you sort of look at a skull, right, is like when you are looking at from the side, like a lot of that sort of width that you see on the front kind of disappears on the edge there. All right, so here we got the mustache, and carry that across. So when you're doing these kind of constructions, it's so important to add in these lines. Like it's really easy for me to line up the bottom of the mustache when I'm doing it in 2 dimensions, but when I'm doing it in 3 dimensions, you got to put in your lines, right? You got to put in your cross-reference lines. All right, same thing here. Thinking about like where these structural elements are, right? Right, so again, the eye here is going to be somewhere like this. Now, I've never found it that useful to add in the eyeball, but it can be a really good thing if you're struggling to add the dimensionality that you need. Now we're sort of looking at that lidded eye, and I probably should wait a little bit to do the eyes, but we're looking at that lidded eye slightly from above. So we're going to see it curve up slightly. This is where, we really see the curvature of that kind of skull. All right, again, let's get this. Let's draw that over there. So we've got a clear picture of where that skull line goes down. Boom. So you can see again, we're starting to find some sense of who the character is through doing this. And as I said, I'm going to have these kind of neck muscles come down. Right, boom. And here is the voice box. And as I said, part of like seeing under there is seeing exactly where, part of the underside is understanding that, we have the jawline here, right? But part of what we're going to see is this kind of flesh, right? So it's going to be a little bit fleshy there. Again, everyone's slightly different. And then we're going to have that sort of voice box even more prominent. And if you were to sort of look under, like at the écorché, you kind of have that little, right, sort of bone there, right? That's gonna tuck in there. And then obviously you're gonna have these muscles coming out here. Now he's starting to look a little bit more buff as I'm kind of forced to put more anatomy on there, just for clarity, right? So again, if we sort of, this is where thinking about our structural drawing is important, right? I'm kind of drawing around the sphere, the Loomis sphere that kind of was there, even though this is sort of lower than halfway. And that's where I'm going to put the ear in. Again, if you get stuck with this stuff, right, just sort of imagine like, yeah, it's kind of coming across there, right? You can kind of see this, like where is it, right? It's kind of, yeah, it's going to come about there. Just draw it as a box first, right? If you ever get stuck with this, the real key is to understand that often, yeah, just start blocking it in, right, with boxes, and that'll often get you where you want. All right, let's use less of Tim McBurney anatomy, more real anatomy. Right, boom. So again, we're kind of there. I feel like this nose needs a bit of tweaking, right? I feel like it's actually, right, again, now that we actually look at it, it's probably coming down a little bit more. Right, it's not really pointing up. And it's obviously going to have some other elements, right? And it's probably not as thick at the end. And it's probably not as wide, right? I think maybe I can have it a little bit. A little bit wide there. And, understanding where all these little subtle features are going to go is super critical, right? Over here, probably, yeah, we're not going to see heaps of that eye. But you can see here, starting to come together, right? Excuse me. Starting to see these different bits and pieces. I'm going to, yeah, start erasing some of the different random lines I kind of had there. And let's see if we can block in the hair, right? It's going to come way up here, but I can still find that center line there. Right, we can find that bit. Boom. Right. Got the structure. Boom, boom. All right. So we're almost there, right? Got to get these crazy eyebrows going. But yeah, that's probably enough, right? We're starting to see, and probably I've added a little bit too much to the neck, right? He's probably not that buff, right? Some of these muscles probably aren't bulging out, right? Probably going a bit more like this. Probably, this, maybe this is a little bit high, but yeah, you refine those based on, how you understand and use the, the actual kind of anatomy that people have, right? Again, there's like specificity is everything. that is the general idea. And obviously, you can keep going, try some sort of different perspectives, different angles, different things that might work. But the trick is that the thing that will actually make your characters feel and look exactly like the character that you want is often these iconic looking features, right? It's often the mustache is going to work, right? Like that is going to work every time. And yeah, all these other subtle little distinctive features that are a little bit more unique. Let's get rid of some of these anatomy lines as we go. Right, it's got this sort of nonchalant raised eye look. Yeah, so there you go. We could keep going. We could keep doing different angles, but that's the basic idea. It's a matter of understanding accuracy, anatomy, primary form, but then understanding that often we got to exaggerate, right? Like I could probably still exaggerate this nose a little bit, really get it, sort of going, make it a little bit bigger. But yeah, the real key to understand is that the way that we actually apply this is critical, and often you don't need to put in all the anatomical markers. The accuracy only gets you so far, and what's going to matter is the way that you create an interesting character, the way you kind of pose them. But the structural anatomy stuff, like studying your primary forms, your skeleton, right? Doing all this anatomical stuff is going to be really useful because it lays the foundation for actually knowing what you're doing with the Loomis method. But the real problem is that, like at this point here where I've roughed in my weird skeleton man, again, this is pretty similar to what we'd actually do with the Loomis method. It's like the groundwork is laid there, but it doesn't look good. It doesn't look like anything. It just looks like a standard person, right? I've maybe changed a couple of proportions. I've set myself up right. Maybe obviously if it was a different character, there'd be a drastically sort of different look. But yeah, the thing that's actually going to make a difference and make the character interesting is often it's actually the character and all those little details. And I think the real challenge is most people never get there because you just kind of get stuck doing the anatomical sort of atelier style repetition. We keep trying to get the Loomis head right. And the reality is Loomis head never looks right because it's symmetrical, boring, static, and dull. And it's only when we actually start to add interesting characters to things, right? Add emotion, think about who they are, start to exaggerate them, that things actually become fun. But hopefully this has been an interesting demo and you've learned a little bit about anatomy, application, and structure, and how the Loomis method, etc., can actually help you. So let's do a little bit of a recap. What we're talking about here in terms of how you learn anatomy is understanding that the foundation is critical. The foundation is what will build your fundamental understanding of proportion, measurement, and you can see so much of what I'm doing there is just measuring. It feels like I'm drawing a fun character, but actually what I'm doing is just measuring one proportion versus another, and I'm thinking about how much bigger this nose is on this character. It's mostly proportion. What we're doing when we're drawing is just proportion, measurement, etc. And you need to understand all the measurements of the face in order to do that properly. The problem is, though, none of that is really worthwhile until you can translate it into your style and until you can actually have fun with it and exaggerate it. Because, as I said a million times, static characters without hair, without eyebrows, with a dull look are always boring, right? We want to draw fun characters and we want to draw them in our style. And often that means you've got to exaggerate and not actually use those proportions. We learn those proportions to train whether or not we can control proportion. Once you can control the proportion, then you can exaggerate it and add your own little twist on it. But none of that really matters until you apply it, because this is where you understand where it fits in the grand scheme of things and where it fits in the bigger picture of you creating an actual illustration. And The reason I did this backwards is so you can kind of see how that ends up, because I think if we just start with doing different head constructions and different sizes, it's not specific. It's only when we actually have a character we're trying to draw that any of this makes any sense. And that's what I've experienced, is just drawing endless Loomis heads, endless study heads, doesn't really tell you whether or not you're measuring correctly. When you're trying to draw a particular character and actually apply these skills, then you can tell whether or not your measurement is good. Because if we're not measuring properly, then often we don't get the right structure. We don't get the right character. And again, getting the right character is what this is all about. Anyway, that's what I've got time for in this particular video. Let me know whether this one helped. This was really a demonstration of a previous video I made talking about the concept of anatomy and structure mixed with exaggeration and style. And then finally, the need to apply application to actually draw interesting characters. Now, I'm actually creating a new series of courses around the concept of stylized anatomy. The one I'm starting with is, no surprise, this is what I've been talking about and thinking about for ages now, is heads. So I have a bit more information down below where you'll be able to go and find out more info on that course. I'll be running it both as a live interactive version where you can get feedback occasionally, and also eventually as just a self-paced course that you can get whenever you want. The goal here is to try and connect up some of the best information we have from the ateliers, the academies, and all the information that has been passed down to us over hundreds of years from all the great artists before us, but combine that with what we're faced with today, which is often trying to create cool characters for stylized anatomy, creating interesting things that we design, and kind of using the same skills, but moving away from just sort of static representational art. Because again, these days, I think it's really fun to be able to create your own world and make sure you do so in your own style. So if you want to check out that previous video that I mentioned that goes over the theory of this, check it out here. And yeah, other than that, take a look at the heads and faces course that I'm working on down below. And yeah, other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.